Let's get started. So I wanted to give a quick little intro before we pass the mic to Ali and Tamara. I'm one of the co-founders of Foreword, and we're a marketplace for live online workshops, specifically for busy startups. So whether you're looking to help your team or help them feel supported in their growth, we've got sessions on being a better manager, soft skills like giving, receiving feedback, DEI, wellness, and a whole list of other things. So for example, after today's webinar, if you think your company can really benefit from improving its ability to manage remote teams or improve asynchronous communication, Ali and Tamara, who will be leading our webinar today, both have phenomenal workshops on that. So just as a heads up, all of our workshops are all live. They're highly interactive, but today's session is more of a webinar style, where it'll be largely informative, less interactive. So it's not entirely representative of what our sessions are like, but along the way, the entire session, please feel free to drop questions in the chat along the way. And Ali and Tamara will be able to field those as they go along. But I'm going to be dropping my email and a link to our catalog of workshops in the chat if you are interested in any sessions for your team. But enough about us. I'm especially excited about this webinar on remote work and what you should be talking about with your leadership team. Obviously a super salient topic, but topic aside, I think what gets me really excited about this session is that we've got Ali Green and Tamara Sanderson running the show here. They're truly domain experts in this space. They've been on the remote train far before we were all thrust into this world, and they're quite literally writing the book on the topic. And so they really get startups. They understand the tech industry more broadly from their time at Google, DuckDuckGo, IDEO, amongst others. So they really understand the unique challenges that a lot of our leadership and people teams are facing. So without further ado, I want to pass the mic over to Ali and Tamara.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the intro. Hi, everybody. We're so excited to be chatting with you today. As I mentioned in the chat, I'd love to know where you're all located and what companies you're coming from. Tam, do you want to kick us off while I start sharing my screen?
Yeah, sure. Brian, thank you so much for the introduction. We are excited to be here. And yes, we are writing a book called Remote Works. It is a pun, but we really want remote work to be able to work for everyone. Today, Ali will be leading the presentation and I am going to be manning the chat. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please add your questions and let's get started. Okay.
Yeah, so what's been really interesting for Tam and I throughout the 18 months that everybody has been really thrust into what has been called the world's greatest work from home experiment, was that we have been working from home for many years prior to 2020, when everyone realized, like, hey, after years of asking our boss, like, can we extend our vacation and do 2 weeks of remote work and 2 weeks of holiday? Or I'm sick, instead of taking a sick day, why can't I be in bed and just respond to these emails? And just hearing no, no, no. And finally, the whole world is working from home. But are we truly remote working? And through our time having our experiences, not only working from home, but working from cafes, working from Cape Town, where we first met, we realized that there were all of these questions that people were asking themselves, and countless amounts of webinars and listicles and advice being shared. But what we realized is this truly what you all should be focused on when you think about the next steps of remote work? Is this truly what you should be talking to your leadership team about? And so I think what most people thought remote work would look like is this dream of sleeping in a little bit later, getting in that morning workout, getting that extra quality time in with the family, being more well-rested, focusing on your mental health, being more productive, reducing that commute, reducing your environmental footprint. And instead, what we got was meetings, So many meetings, morning and night. So instead of wearing comfy clothes, taking our breaks to work out, and spending more time from our children, we have been struck by the zombie apocalypse. We've been thrust into Zoom fatigue. We have been thinking about Slack messages that have become more and more urgent, turning asynchronous communication into things where we expect, even if we don't admit it to ourselves, a real-time response. And I think everybody's at their breaking point. And when we look into the future of remote work, so many things has come out of this experiment. Did it actually work? Did we actually try? What is the future? Is it hybrid? And so we're going to discuss some of these expectations versus the reality and more as we go through today's presentation. Pam, what are some of your initial expectations when you went into remote work, and how did those change during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think I have an unusual story. So I was in an all remote company before the pandemic. I worked at Automatic, which owns WordPress.com, Tumblr, WooCommerce, and I loved working remotely. But by the time the pandemic had happened, I had joined IDEO, which is a lovely design consulting firm, but they were very studio based. We would go in and use Post-it notes, and we had a craft room and a hardware room, and it was really fun. But then when we were all brought home to continue the same work, it was very tricky. And so my expectations is it would be like Automatic again. And in reality, I was on Zoom a lot, and there were a lot of growing pains that as designers, we were able to get through, but it was not the same as I had lived before. And also, I think there's a huge difference of remote work in a pandemic and remote work not in a pandemic. So I was at home all the time and never in a cafe, never traveling. My remote work life became a lot less Instagram worthy during the pandemic than maybe it was before.
Yeah, I love that you talk about that, because my expectations versus reality since working remotely since 2014, and you and I met in Cape Town, and so it's totally Instagram worthy. And I have this productivity hack that I love to share and talk about, which is one location, one goal. So I used to bounce around towns and cities like crazy. And so instead of feeling like a tourist, I was getting my work done because I would throw in my breaks by jumping to different cafes. So I'd go to one cafe to focus on creating a hiring strategy for a company I was working for. And then I would take a 10-15 minute walk around town, take some pictures, enjoy the sights, settle into a co-working space to use their phone booth to have meetings and one-on-ones with the employees that I manage. And then finally I would, go back home, be able to cook myself lunch, and maybe settle into my sofa and read through resumes of people I was looking for to join the team. And so it was this really dynamic lifestyle. So even for me, the shift from remote work and true remote work to this working from home model, where I was in rural France for the big first lockdown in 2020 in a studio apartment with my partner and sometimes 2 children. And so I know a lot of the pain that people faced when they were like, oh, now all of a sudden we need to make this home environment also work for our office environment. And even me, without that external stimuli, had to readjust. How am I supposed to be productive when I literally only have one room to make all of these things happen? My entertainment, my sleep, my cooking, my working. And so the adjustment of that lack of freedom for me was a huge shift of the expectations I had built since 2014 to the reality of this isn't a reflection of companies learning how to do this in the best environment. And so if we can do it in the worst environment, what are the lessons that we can learn? And I think we're starting to see that now. We're seeing a lot of articles come out from big companies that are having interesting stances around remote work, either bringing people back to the office or going as far as New Zealand to work themselves. And so before we jump into some of the interesting questions and conversations that you should be having with your leadership teams around remote work, I want to start with a basic assumption around remote work and talk about if this assumption makes sense, and if so, why? And if it doesn't make sense, how do we start from this main assumption to talk with our leadership teams about truly how do we even define remote work? What does it mean? And so there's been this assumption that we have been working remotely for the past 18 months. And Tam, I think you and I have just highlighted some of the reasons why that's not true. I think the biggest reason is remote work is so much more than a physical location. Remote work is about what is the level of autonomy that you and your teams are having? How do you structure the work? Is it being saved in a cloud? Is there central places for documentation? What are your processes? What is your communication strategy? What are the things that you're talking about in terms of the tools and templates and systems that you're building a culture around? And so when you think of this assumption of remote is more than just a physical location, it's a mindset of a company. I think too automatic, and something that Matt from Automatic, your former CEO, put into place in terms of the 5 levels of autonomy. And I don't think the picture is quite showing up on the slides. But Tam, I'd love for you to really highlight how was this talked about during your time at Automatic, and what do you think other leaders should be thinking about when they think about what level of remote work autonomy they should adopt as part of their culture?
Yes, so I love this. And I'll share this in the chat in just a second, but it's essentially a pyramid, and it looks a lot like Maslow's hierarchy. And at the very bottom, you have completely synchronous work. This means you have to be in office and you have to be face-to-face with people to get anything done. And as you go to step 5, at the very peak, that's the nirvana of remote work. And this means that you can get your work done at your own time, on your own pace. You do not have to change things based on time zones. You are working completely autonomously, even if you're at a large organization. And what I found interesting is even at Automatic, Matt felt like we had only reached stage 4, not stage 5. And right now, most companies are in that 2 to 3 range, which means that you have practiced it. You can do some remote work. You can technically do your job from home, but you're still doing a lot of synchronous communication. You need to be on at the same hours. You're on Zoom a lot. And I think it was really interesting in the chat, Jerry was just bringing up the fact that they made some really simple rules at their company, but before they were expected to be on Slack all the time. And if you're expected to be on Slack all the time, it no longer is an async form of communication, it's synchronous. You can't do heads down time if somebody's pinging you all the time. But I love what Jerry mentioned is that they actually started, putting statuses. They said, I'm not available. And I think things like that are showing that you're moving from a stage 2 to a stage 3. You're allowing more autonomy. You're allowing people to make decisions, and you're allowing people to, design their own work life.
Yeah, I love that story. And I think back to before we even used terms of remote work and hybrid, one of my very first work experiences was working for a fast growing startup. And so I remember at first we were in this small 1-level office in Washington, D.C. in Chinatown. And every day I would walk to work and I would go into the office. And then suddenly we got too big and we couldn't be part of that office anymore. So then we had an office down the street and we grew out of that office. And then we had an office in another neighborhood. And so it was now impossible to just walk down the street for meetings. And so what we started to do is we started to have conference calls for meetings. And we started to sometimes have meetings in person if we were working with someone new for the first time and we wanted to build a relationship with someone. And we used to share our status updates with our team of, hey, I'm actually going to work at the Foggy Bottom office today, or I'm going to work at the Chinatown office today. And we didn't realize it then, but what we were doing was a form of setting expectations, having trust and autonomy that people were where they said they were going to be, that people were getting their work done, that people could have the conversations they needed on the phone instead of booking a conference room, and that all of the information and all the work that we were doing was on the computer and being saved on the cloud anyways. And so everyone had access to the same files, regardless of what office they worked in. And those are the cornerstones of remote work that technology has enabled us. Which is why I think it's so interesting that we're now still having this conversation around what do we call this that we're doing now? Like, what are the rules that we should put down with how we work? And if you use this 5 levels of autonomy and you say, okay, where is our organization at now? And why? And where would we like to go and why? This can be a first initial thought exercise for you and your leadership team to have an idea in mind, not just if you want to go remote or not, if you want to be hybrid or not, if you want distributed offices around the world, but what level of autonomy do you want to give your employees? How do you want to have information shared and stored and documented? What type of communication best practices do you want to have in place? And once you're able to define all of that, then bringing in HR strategies and policies and handbooks to describe what that looks like in terms of your physical location can be a lot easier. And so one very tactical tip that I would have from everyone is, instead of trying to start from a place of compliance, start from a place of how do we communicate? How do we manage our projects? What is the definition of done? And work your way back up till you can decide, okay, then do we need to have a compliance policy in place for it to be hybrid or not? And so speaking of hybrid, a question that I think is the wrong question, but a question that I've seen too many times to count over the past 6 months on LinkedIn especially, is what should our return to office, or what I hate more, what should our return to work plan look like, assuming that people haven't been working for the past 18 months, and to hybrid or to not hybrid. And I think this is the wrong question for so many reasons. It's the wrong question because it's thinking about the brick and mortar location. To me, this is a real estate strategy question. It's, do you want to continue to invest in a physical location that you fully lease or don't lease? Or do you want to become more flexible with your rental properties, your overhead, your financial strategy? And so this is not so much a question of remote work. It's a question of, how do you build a strategy amongst your leadership team to think about your finance strategy, your costs, and how it boils down to the things we just talked about in terms of what are your goals for processes, what are your goals for communication. And Tamara, you explained this best in a recent article that you wrote for the Center of Advancement for Virtual Organizations. And I just loved the reasons that you shared so much around why people are so focused on this idea of the hybrid organization. Here's a little teaser of the reasons why. And I'd love to know, like, what do you think it is about these 3 reasons that really hit the nail on the head?
Yeah, so I think organizations are made up of people. And often when we're having these discussions about hybrid or not hybrid, we fall into a lot of human traps. And this is very normal because we are humans making decisions. But what I have noticed is there's a desire to satisfy. So there's this concept of maximizers versus satisficers. A maximizer is somebody that is going to do all the research till they make the very best decision. A satisficer is somebody that solves the problem with the first available solution that fits all of the needs. And there are benefits and there are detriments to each of these. But what I am noticing in this decision is I do feel like a lot of people are satisficing on a hybrid way of working because they know that people have worked in person before. They now know that people have worked at home. And that is an easy decision. But the thing is in some ways, I think people are kind of kicking the can down the road and not making a decision. If you look at sunk costs, so this is a thing where, let's imagine you go to a baseball game with your family. It is super hot, your team is losing, your kids are crying, and you have a sunburn. But because you bought those tickets, you're going to stay all 9 innings and nobody is going to have a good time. That's an example of sunk costs. Because you bought that ticket beforehand and you had this ideal view of what it would look like, you're not letting go of it. In some ways, I think we're doing a lot of the same things with our real estate strategy. We have these beautiful campuses, we have these offices, we have this culture. And while that is very important and there are these great artifacts, I do think you need to start making decisions of, based on this point today, how would we build this company? Not 20 years ago, this is how we built the company. And last would be self-serving reasoning. I do feel a lot of times we make arguments based on what we want. And really what needs to be happening in organizations is interviewing people, asking what a lot of people want, and coming up with solutions that are creative, that take into account all of those needs. Because I know for my own self, I have given self-serving reasonings of why I really loved an office and why I've really loved working from home. I was previously at Google. My friend Shapur is in the audience. And I used to love going to campus. I loved the free food. I loved being in Silicon Valley. But things changed in my life. And all of a sudden, I really wanted to work from home. And then I had self-serving reasoning for that. And the thing is that is my own perspective. And if I am making a decision for a larger organization, it can't just be based on what I want. It needs to be based on what is good for the organization, the business objectives, and all of the people that are a part of that organization.
So well said. And so for everyone out there in the audience thinking about, okay, well, how do we make our decision? The question that you should bring to your next leadership team is simple yet complex. If you were going to start your business today, what would you choose? Having an office, going remote, or being hybrid? And more importantly, why? If you're able to intentionally answer that question and loop it back to your business objectives, your values, and be able to explain it to your employees in a way that isn't tainted by satisfying sunk costs or self-serving reasoning from the leadership team, then chances are this is a decision that is not only right, but will have the buy-in of the middle managers, which will help you with the change management if any changes are needed one way or another, and make this decision very empowering for individual contributors to be able to get comfortable with in the long term and buy into and know if it's the right company for them to continue to support and grow and help you reach your business objectives. An interesting follow-up question that I've seen there then is, okay, let's say we intentionally decide that we do want to go back into the office or we do want to go hybrid. Now we're seeing so many problematic articles come out that talk about how to win hybrid from an employee perspective and how to hack the system. And the reason why this is problematic is it's assuming that there's going to always be a perception that face time equals performance. And so as leaders, you might be asking yourself, how can we avoid that perception? How can we fall into that trap? Which is great that you don't want to fall in the trap. But the reason why that is the wrong question is it's assuming that you're relying on this idea of what got us here will get us there. And so historically, there has been this culture, this performance, this appearance or optics, the Mad Men world of doing your work. There's been advice that I was given when I first entered the workforce of stay as late in the office until your boss leaves. And that's how they know that you're dedicated, that you're hardworking, that you're productive. Well, when I'm asked as a remote work expert, how do you know if remote employees are actually working? My response is, how did you know that your employees in the office were actually working if when they graduated university, like I did, got the advice to just stay as late as their manager? Shouldn't the results come from the work itself? Which is the second problem. For a lot of leaders, it's harder to determine clear metrics than it is to just judge the amount of input put in. So what remote work has done for us, it has put a magnifying glass on how we make decisions in an organization. As a leadership team, the things that you should be discussing is, what are our definitions of success? How will we measure success? What are the metrics in which we're going to judge ourselves as an organization, each individual team and each individual contributor? And what does done look like at a macro scale and then at a micro scale? Are we able to teach employees to learn what done means for the day? Should they be judging themselves based off of a day's work, a week's worth of work, a month's worth of work, or a project worth of work? And depending on your organization, your goals, how fast you move, how fast your industry moves, those answers might be variable. And so spending the upfront time to define your metrics can save you a lot of time and energy down the line. But it's a lot different than, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. means that you're working. And
Alex,
so
can I add a fun fact in here?
Please, please do. I love fun facts.
I was interviewing someone for a book, and he told me a fact the other day, and it kind of blew my mind. He said that in traditional work, so the 40-hour work week when people were always going into the office, the amount of productive work that was happening on average was only 2 hours and 53 minutes of that 8-hour day. And so I don't know. I was surprised. I thought it would be a little bit more than that. And we do need to have, clear metrics in order to, it's just, if you just go in to an office, you're not necessarily going to come out with 8 hours a day. And I think we have to re-envision, what does it look like to show what you are doing and what you are accomplishing during that time.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's really important to ask on the leadership level, but each team as well, what does done look like? How will success be measured? In my experience at DuckDuckGo, we had a template that even explained a pre-mortem for projects, where we challenged each individual contributor to write down, these are the steps I need to take to complete the project. This is where the project might fail. And these are the deadlines where I think I could accomplish things if everything goes according to plan. And then we were able to say on Monday, this is my single top priority. If everything goes wrong during the week, this is still what I hope to get done and what I will focus on and what I will ask help for. And on Friday, a self-report of how close that goal was and why. And if you missed it, then you were held accountable to having to explain, where were the gaps? Was it a knowledge gap? Was it because you didn't understand your own productivity? Was it because there were all these fires that came that were significantly more urgent? And those conversations are great learning and development conversations. Those conversations help you as a manager, as a leader, understand the talent you have in your organization a lot more than missed deadlines without that, self-awareness. And so I think these questions are really helpful in that regard as well. So let's continue. Once you know what you're working on and why, another question that always makes me smile is, should you still try to make the office experience as good as possible, or will that lead to people feeling left out? Again, I think this is a question where the heart is in the right place, like trying to create this experience for everyone. It's a way of satisfying. How do we make an office experience great? How do we make a remote experience great? Well, it's assuming something that's simply not true, which is that people are motivated in the same way. And I think what we really need to remember is that not all motivation looks the same. It can change even person by person, as Tam mentioned in her own career, early on wanting that excitement, that hustle and bustle of the Google office, to wanting the more flexibility and freedom of a remote environment. And so if not all motivation looks the same, I think it's important to know in organizations that trying to create opportunities for fun in an office won't necessarily deter someone who's remote from having perks of being remote. Where this gets tricky and where it's an important conversation for you and your leadership team and your HR team to come together is, how do we make equitable benefit strategies that will ensure both people have optimal opportunities to advance their skill set in work in order to be recognized, in order to be promoted? How do we ensure that if there are fun events going on in the office, that they're truly optional, that they're inclusive of the knowledge? And so information that might casually be shared in the office is documented remote first. And so if one person is remote, the information needs to be remote. And how do you store that information? What is your knowledge base? How do you get that information accessible to everybody in the organization? And so the important questions here that you should be talking to your leadership team are, what processes are you going to create to ensure that the basic truths for motivation are upheld in both environments? If someone is motivated by recognition, how do you provide recognition remotely? How do you provide recognition in an office? If someone is motivated by freedom and flexibility, how do you ensure freedom and flexibility is part of your culture, regardless if you're hybrid, remote, or office only? And then two, how do you as a company want to motivate your employees despite the location? Like, how does that tie into your core values? Do you want to motivate them intrinsically? Do you want to motivate them only through more traditional means of bonuses and your total compensation package. And so this is a great opportunity to get your HR team, your benefits team involved in having conversations, not just around how do we offer benefits to be competitive to employees we're going to recruit, but how do we offer benefits to motivate our employees to do a behavior that we want to continue to see. And so one thing that I love about remote companies, and it's interesting why remote companies offer this benefit, is a benefit to be able to go to co-working spaces and to offer a stipend to go to co-working spaces. And if you ask remote companies why they offer this benefit, different HR leaders will say different reasons. And so for some, it's so our employees can be more productive. We know that they might have a small apartment, hello, my studio apartment that I quarantined in, and getting work done there is impossible. And so they want to motivate people to be more productive. And so they're thinking through a productivity lens. If you ask others, it's, well, there's been so many reports that employees who work remotely struggle with isolation. So by offering a chance for them to go to a co-working space, they have an opportunity to be with people in their local communities, and they have a social outlet. And so it's a company who likely values social connection and, wanting that fun brainstorm and creativity and ability to connect with others. And so offering a benefit for that lens, and the stories you tell around those benefits are incredibly powerful as you continue to develop your strategy. And so when it comes to motivation, I think that's incredibly important to say. Tam, have you seen, I know you worked for a company transitioning to remote only because of the pandemic. How did they handle some of these motivational strategies?
I think what I witnessed, not only at the company I was at, but other companies, people were trying to copy and paste what worked in the office and try to do that virtually. So we had a Monday meeting that was really fun and creative, and we would then do that on VC, or we had all these in-person events and we would try to make that happen on video conference. And I think what we noticed as an organization, we were all designers, was that the magic wasn't there. But then we started thinking through, ways that we can make this actually a lot more engaging. And so sometimes we would get stuff mailed to us, and then we would do something there, or we could plan our own events with our team. There was a lot of different creative inspiration that we could take part of. There were lessons that we could do. And I think when they started thinking through what would work better in a remote context, the offerings became a lot more interesting.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that dives right into our next question, which is around company culture. There's been so much concern around how do we make sure company culture not only stays alive, but continues to thrive if companies choose to go remote? Or how do we make sure company culture continues during the pandemic? Or how can we ensure people keep in touch socially? This is another, again, fascinating question to me. I could do a whole, I think, webinar, and Tam, I think you could too, about just this question, because we just love culture in every aspect. And I think it gets our sociology brains on high alert. But I think it's important. And so a funny example, and then I can talk about a serious example, is I spent the summer I'm in Normandy, France, and I'm living in this big castle, co-working with families. And so there's been lots of kids around, but they've been kids from a bunch of different cultures. And so we've had people from France, we've had people from the United States. We have a family right now from Japan. My nephew who lives in the United States, I talk all the time. All of these kids are so well-versed in Pokemon. I don't really know anything about Pokemon, but all I know is that none of these kids have met each other before this summer, but here in the castle, instantly they were able to bond over the culture of Pokemon. And culture doesn't exist in the confines of four walls in an office. And as soon as you step outside of a company and remove the word company from it, you realize it. There's a whole culture around Pokemon, the rituals of getting cards and trading cards, the interest in talking about the different types and your favorite ones, and how it's become something that different people around the world can identify with. If you think about culture, you think about the culture of the nationality, maybe of where you're from and the different icons that exist within that. Another funny thing that happens this summer is I've had the opportunity to teach at least 20 people what a s'more is. And it's something that's made me culturally so proud to be an American. And it's so silly. I'm like, oh, but this dessert over a campfire, it's such a ritual. And it's something that's so strong in my memories of a child, roasting a marshmallow over a fire. And it seems so silly, but the way that I can teach someone about it and then share a story, and it allows for a social connection because of that. These are things that can happen in an office context, in a company context as well, regardless of if you're physically coming together.
And Allie, I want to chime in really quickly. I think what is fascinating about what you just shared is culture and ritual is innate to the human experience. If you can have children that are from different countries, might not even speak the same language, and they can share in the ritual of Pokemon, or you can all share, a s'more with people that have never had one before. I think sometimes we think of culture in the big C of like, you have to have an HR policy and this is how we're going to look at culture for a corporation. But ultimately, you're probably already having rituals and culture on different teams. And you may want to just see like, what are people naturally doing and how can you elevate that to the broader organization?
Exactly. And I think it's important here is that your culture is more than you think it is. And so really taking a step back, how are you defining your culture? If you're only defining your culture by your company happy hours, and things that are written on your walls or the colors of your office, then maybe you need to take a deeper look through that sociology lens and think through what are some of the rituals in your organization that you can tailor or redefine or reinvent or create new for a remote environment. And going back to this idea of motivation, one thing that I loved in my environment remotely was recognition in a remote company. And we had a ritual of doing peer recognition every week where people would write in anonymous tips of someone who went above and beyond in their role. And it got to a point amongst my team where we had like an anonymous poet. And they would write these like little raps or haikus, and every week it was different. And people really tuned in to the meeting that we had every week, just because they cared so much about who, not only who won, who got the initial final recognition, but it was a way to learn what was going on in the company, who's working on what, because it talked about the projects that were going on. There was eventually a little bit of competitiveness around who could write a better poem or who was the poet, like guessing who it was, which really helped people get to know each other because people were more interested in learning about people's passions outside of work so they could guess who might be the poet. You got to recognize people and share in people's successes and wins in the organization. And so that is one way to build a culture remotely, where it was a standing ritual that we had every week, where then the torch was passed and the person that won it the week before had a responsibility to lead it the week after. And so leadership wasn't involved necessarily. It was something that lived on. And by the definition of culture, you want it to live on without someone ruling over you. And so when I think about culture and how as a leadership team you can try to intentionally curate culture in your company, the questions that I think are the most important to ask are, what are your standard operating behaviors in your organization? And I love this term, standard operating behaviors. I don't know who uses it, but we use it. Basically, what are the behaviors that you want to reward in your organization? Is it behaviors like stating the time zone of you and the person you're talking to? Is it something like putting an agenda in every meeting you're having? What are like the little things that you want to acknowledge or reward or have to be repeatable in your organization? And what are the things that you want to avoid in your organization? And over time, there'll be standard truths of how people act that are common, that are the way things are done here. And if you can think ahead intentionally about what are the positive things we want to curate, that's how you can start to talk about culture. And then from there, you can think about, well, how can we introduce symbols, rituals like the one that I just described with the passing of the torch, regardless of location? What are the things that can just live on in people's stories virtually and things of that nature? So we're nearing the end, and I want to save room for some of the questions that Tam, you're getting in Slack. But we can't do a webinar about remote work without talking about Zoom fatigue. So Zoom fatigue, how do you combat it? How do you make hybrid meetings work? Like, what's going on with meetings? Everybody seems super, super concerned these days about meetings. Tam, I'd love to hear, like, amongst your peer group, you know, how things are going on your end of the world. What are some of the wrong questions that you've been hearing about meetings?
Ooh, well, I have a strong point of view here. I think when I hear people talk about meetings, they often talk about how they could use a filter or do a fun trick for an existing Zoom meeting. And I actually like to, I don't know, go to like first principles. Does this meeting need to exist? And if there's one thing I could recommend that you try to do, look through your calendar, do a meeting audit, and think through which ones need to be synchronous and which ones need to be asynchronous. Because I bet you there are a couple meetings you could just take off the calendar and it would give everybody some free time. And I bet you also that you're doing some meetings that are work about work. And I think in some ways you need to start thinking through what is a coordination problem. And if it's a coordination problem, you can often deal with that in written communication or in Asana or through a project management, status update, ritual, and then save Zoom for communication. And another thing I would also recommend, I think if you're doing a lot of one-on-ones, something that can be really nice is actually just getting on the phone. And we used to have a one-on-one with my kind of business lead at IDEO, and we would both go for a walk and we wouldn't see each other and we would just be on our phone. And so I think that can be a nice way to actually do your one-on-ones and switch it up so you're not always looking. I've literally never seen my face this much in my entire life. And so yeah, but just I say do a meeting audit and get rid of a couple of them if you can.
Yeah, I love a good meeting audit. There's so many important things. I want to highlight two things that you just said before sharing with everybody how they can bring these questions back to their leadership team. One is we talk about remote work, the importance of over communication and transparency. And I think one of the biggest miscommunications or misconceptions that happened is people equating more communication with more meetings, which is not true, because meetings are not the only form of communication. You can have living FAQ docs, you can have knowledge bases, you can have running documentation threads. So many more tools exist today than a long time ago, than even 6 months ago, than even 2 weeks ago, to be able to communicate to people with lots of different communication styles. My favorite way of communicating instead of a meeting, which is super old school, like I'm a big fan of the equivalent of a napkin drawing, and I used to take a picture of it and upload it into Asana so everyone could see my mind map and my brainstorm before I wrote a formal proposal, just so they could really take that journey with me. And I think that's one of the benefits of asynchronous communication is we have pictures, we have charts, we have video, we have audio, we have so many more tools than just a meeting. And so I think that's really cool. And a challenge you can have with your meeting audit is saying, what could we do instead of making this a meeting? Like, could it be a asynchronous video? Could it be a picture? Could it be an email, which is kind of boring at this point already, but still can be highly effective. And so I think that's one really good challenge you can do with your leadership team is what could this be instead? And then the other thing, Tam, that I love is this idea, which is probably counterintuitive to advice that even we've given in the past around just jump on the phone and do an old school phone call. They're great. And so there is this idea of video calls and this mirror exposure effect, a term that maybe you've heard about, building trust through video and being able to see people and get in touch with, what their facial expression is giving off and if they're tuned in. And I think that's great when you're building trust with someone. When the trust is already established, it is exhausting. It takes so much mental capacity that we aren't naturally conditioned for, to not have our peripheral vision and be looking at a screen all day, that when the trust is already built, getting on a phone call and not having the stress of having to, do your hair or get out of your gym clothes and just being able to take a walk can be incredibly refreshing, especially in these days. And so I think that's awesome advice. Some
Allie,
questions.
can I give just an example of how we work together? So I am based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Allie is in France this summer at a castle. Well, I'm in a very hot 1-bedroom apartment right now because it is, I don't have much air conditioning. And then Allie usually lives in Spain. So we are remote working. But for example, we have a call every Friday and we make it a video call and I see Allie's face and we connect. But besides that, everything else is largely async, or, a lot of the ways we communicate is in docs. We comment back and forth. We write our brainstorms. We set expectations. We're on WhatsApp. And so we'll send kind of, quick updates. But just imagine, I think when you're trying to think of ways that you can communicate with your team, just think about how you communicate with people outside of work. Like, do you send a picture to your family? Do you think about how you're using TikTok or Facebook or Instagram? All of those methods are communication. And I think it's really interesting when you think, okay, this is how I communicate with, this friend. How would I bring that into my work life? Or what is a different version for it? And it can really get your mind brainstorming different ways that you can share information. And also, like, a system can be communication. Putting stuff in Asana is a form of communication. Adding comments into a Google Doc is a form of communication. So also expand outside that communication has to be person to person. It can also be person to system, system to person.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, just again, like, you can meet people where they're at. So I think people get so hung up on all of the fancy tools, and there's such amazing products that exist for remote workers these days, but you can be as basic as WhatsApp and Google Docs if you need to. It's more about the expectations that you put into place. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember for companies that are just getting started as well, is it doesn't have to be overly complex at first. It just has to be about getting on the same page figuratively and literally. So to wrap up that, some questions that you all should be talking about with your leadership team. First and foremost, does this have to be a meeting? If the answer is no, what other forms of communication can support this information flow and be inclusive? And Tam gave a lot of creative ideas for that, like pictures, internal TikToks. I know even like internal podcasts and making private podcasts could be something really interesting to people as well that don't want to be on video all of the time. And so I think those are just some really great ways to think through what does our communication strategy look like at work. So to sum up.
We have a question from the audience. Maybe we
can
can talk about that before we kind of, are wrapping up. But Renee wants to know if you have any tips about making hybrid offices work. And that is when, obviously you have some employees that are in the office and some are remote. So I'd love some of your best tips, Allie.
Yeah. So again, I would urge you to not think about this as a hybrid environment. I like to think that if one employee is remote, the work processes need to be fully remote. And so my tips there are, I'll start with bigger strategy, and then we can get more tactical. And then Tam, you should add in yours as well. From a strategic point of view, reiterating that it is, a distributed culture in the sense that not everyone will be in the office. And so as a culture, you value and encourage people to communicate in a way that's transparent to everybody. You set clear expectations with your team. You create an HR policy that explains who is required to be in the office and if that's on any sort of schedule, and who is not required to be in the office and why. What are the exceptions? How do people request to be remote or not? you have a clear and easy to understand compensation policy around the office workers, remote workers, and a clear benefit package. So are you going to support internet expenses, for example, for your remote employees? Are you going to offer free lunch for your office employees? Therefore, are you going to send snack packages home for your remote employees? So from an HR standpoint, making sure that you have all of those things well documented and written in a policy that's easy to understand. And then very tactically, what this looks like to me is if an ad hoc conversation does happen in the office, that the standard operating behavior is like, yes, it happens, but then you immediately write a write-up in your documentation tool that the team uses. And so if that's Notion, then you say like, hey, me and Tam, randomly had coffee today and we chatted about the launch of this new Foreword course that we're doing. And we had these new ideas. Here are the new ideas. Here are the other stakeholders mention them that should be involved. We would love your input by this time, this date, this time zone. Here are our proposed next steps, and make sure decisions, information, questions, answers all live online, not in an office environment. And then another tactical favorite I have is for meetings to make them more inclusive. I love one person, one square. The Brady Bunch squares on Zoom. Even if you're all in an office, I think it's really great to have each person dial in from their own separate computer to create a sense of equality, that every person has their opinion that matters and is represented in one square, rather than seeing like 4 people in a room that could put themselves on, and then the other person feels left out. Because I could have just said something to myself and you guys didn't know what I said, and that sucks. So those would be my tips for making hybrid offices work.
And then just to add on to that, Allie, I actually think remote work is a great forcing function to get your knowledge base up to snuff. And so there's so much information. And if you think of knowledge workers, your crown jewel should be knowledge. And if you are in an office, often that knowledge just goes missing. It becomes a bug. It is shared between people and then it is forgotten. And with remote work, it really is a forcing function to document. And when you've documented, I know documentation sounds like very boring, but it can be a superpower. I remember going from Google to Automatic, and all of a sudden when I was at Automatic, because we had a really strong ritual and process of documenting everything in blog posts, and it was where all of our meeting notes were captured because the meeting was the blog post. But I would go into corp dev and business development meetings, and I actually had a record of every single time we had met with Amazon, every single time we had met with Google. And I felt like I was going into that meeting being omnipresent, all knowing, where before in other corporations, I would have only known what I had heard. I would only know if I had been invited, one of the 4 people invited in that wall, or I had read that email. And with the great documentation, I actually felt I had this whole history, and I could, I could refer to everything we had ever done together in a partnership. And it made my job easier, and it also made me significantly better at my job. And we have another question from Jerry, and this is a popular one. How do you guys deal with time differences?
Yeah, so before I answer for the 2 of us, I'd love to answer from my previous life at DuckDuckGo. So in that environment, we were fully distributed. When I started, there were 30 people. At the time that I left, we were about 100 people, and I personally managed a team of about 5 people while traveling to different time zones. So people never knew if I was in Mexico or Vietnam. So time zones were a constant issue for the people that reported up to me and the people that I collaborated with in more as we grew of a larger company environment. And one of the things that really we preached and that I loved talking about in that environment was a focus away from work hours to most respectful meeting times. And so what this meant for me in practice was getting to know the people that I managed and what their life was. Did they have partners that worked traditional company jobs and therefore they wanted to match their schedule so they could have quality time only in the evening with that person? Did they have other obligations such as caring for an elderly parent or a child? Did they have, just like what else was going on in their life? Like, or, what we teach about productivity, and we talk about, tracking your energy. Like, when are you most productive? So even when I was physically in the United States, it just so happens that I am a solid afternoon person. And I love working in the late afternoon to the evening. And so even when it was common to have a meeting at 11 a.m., it wouldn't have been my first preference. And so when it comes to time zone differences, I think it's most important to ask. I love the idea of having people kickoffs that translate into team charters where you learn this is when people love having meetings. This is when people would accept meetings, and this is a no-go time for meetings. For everyone that you work closely with. You can translate in that to a tool that does it automatically. If your company allows, like a Calendly, for example, you can write that into your team charter. So for synchronous availability, things like that is great. But the biggest thing with time zones that's awesome, and like the best reason for distribution, is the work in a way never has to stop. So if you have this culture of documentation, as Tam was saying, it automatic, like writing things like their blog posts, and you can go in and read something and it feels as if you have been in the room, and you can immediately work on that because you have full understanding of what the goal is. You have all of the resources needed to do your job, and you don't need to wait for someone to get an answer. Then the time zones are great because you can start working on something in your time zone regardless of where other people are. And so I think the two tips I have for time zone differences there is a shift to asynchronous becomes even more important, especially with clear expectations, and two, most respectful meeting times. It could be more respectful for someone to have an 8 a.m. meeting and an 8 p.m. meeting if you're going from New York to Vietnam. Even though neither of those times are traditional business hours, then try to find anything in between.
We have a question if folks can get a copy of the deck as a reference.
So I know that we're recording this, and Foreword will be writing a little blog post about the presentation today. So be sure to look out for the blog post and the video recording itself. So you'll be able to get that for reference. And if you would like to continue to see resources from us and to learn more about our thought leadership around remote work, you can feel free to go to our website, remoteworksbook.com, or connect with us on LinkedIn. Allie Green, Tamara Sanderson. And just again, I know we're hitting the end time, but remote work, it's all about being intentional. So ask the right questions, have the right conversations with your leadership team. And when in doubt, the question why is always a great place to start. So thank you all so much for attending, and I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you all are.
Thank you.